In a single sentence, she dismantled years of his posturing, using his own words. The hearing room froze. A hush rippled through the chamber as Rep. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice calm but sharpened like a blade. On the other side of the table, Governor Doug Burgum's confident smirk faltered. His eyes flickered with recognition, as if he knew exactly what was coming, but had no escape route left. She had done her homework. Buried in the archives, tucked away in a forgotten interview from 2019, were Burgum's own declarations, statements that undercut every word he had spoken today. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she let the silence do the heavy lifting. The tension pressed down like a weight, every second stretching out longer than the last. "Governor," she said evenly, "does this sound familiar?" Then she read his words back to him. His words, not twisted, not paraphrased, quoted. The room inhaled collectively. The stenographer's pen paused mid-stroke. Even the cameras seemed to zoom closer, desperate to capture the instant when power cracked. Burgum's jaw tightened. For years he had built his brand on projection, certainty, bravado, the posture of a man who could not be rattled. But now, confronted with the undeniable echo of his past, his mask slipped. And the brilliance of it all was Crockett's composure. She didn't gloat. She didn't jeer. She simply held the truth like a mirror and forced him to see himself. That's what made the clip explode across the internet within hours. It wasn't a shout down, it was a dismantling. Calm, deliberate, devastating. Viewers at home rewound the moment again and again. Social media erupted with disbelief and delight. Hashtags trended. Side-by-side memes of Burgum 2019 vs. Burgum now flooded timelines. But the most striking part of the exchange was the silence. The second after she finished reading, the second before he scrambled for words. It was the silence of someone caught by the gravity of their own hypocrisy. And yet, that silence was only the beginning. The confrontation didn't emerge from nowhere. It was years in the making. But to understand why this single clip went viral, we need to rewind. Back to the arrogance, the contradictions, and the storm that was about to explode. The hearing wasn't just another day in Washington. It was a stage set for a clash of values, a confrontation over truth itself. At its core, the session was about accountability, leaders being forced to answer not only for their policies, but for the contradictions that revealed who they truly were when the cameras weren't rolling. That's why millions tuned in. That's why the moment mattered. Doug Burgum walked in with the air of a man convinced he could charm or bulldoze his way through anything. His tie was crisp, his posture straight, his smile rehearsed. He'd spent years building an image, steady, unflappable, above the fray. To his supporters, he embodied authority. To his critics, he radiated the kind of arrogance that comes from believing power is permanent. The stakes were higher than his own reputation. This was about whose voices carried weight in the halls of power. Would it be the voices that dismissed lived experience, brushed aside systemic inequities, and cloaked contradictions in polished rhetoric? Or would it be the voices of those who stood firm, refusing to be diminished, refusing to let hypocrisy pass unchallenged? Crockett understood the gravity. For her, this wasn't about a soundbite or a viral moment. It was about defending something larger, the principle that leaders must answer to the truth, even when it's inconvenient, even when it exposes their double standards. She sat quietly at her desk, reviewing her notes, her eyes fixed not on Burgum, but on the words he had once spoken, the evidence that could pierce his armor. The contrast couldn't have been sharper. On one side, Burgum leaned back, answering questions with the dismissive confidence of someone who assumed his word was final. On the other side, Crockett remained still, calm, and deliberate, waiting. Every time he brushed off a challenge, every time he smirked at a line of questioning, she was storing it away, building the case that would unravel him. And it mattered because Americans watching weren't just seeing two politicians spar. They were seeing a reflection of the struggle playing out across the country. Arrogance versus accountability, denial versus truth, privilege versus resilience. The hearing room became a microcosm of something larger. Each time Burgum waved away concerns, Crockett's resolve deepened. She knew that when her moment came, it would not just be about winning an argument. It would be about proving that dignity can dismantle arrogance, that preparation can topple posturing, and that truth still has power in a world flooded with spin. And so, the stage was set. The cameras were rolling. The nation leaned in, sensing that something bigger than a routine exchange was about to unfold. Burgum believed he had the upper hand, cloaked in confidence, insulated by years of political muscle memory. But Crockett held something he didn't expect, something he couldn't spin away. And just when Burgum thought he was in control, Crockett reminded him of something he desperately wanted forgotten. To understand why Jasmine Crockett's strike landed with such force, you first have to understand Doug Burgum. On the surface, he carried himself with the polish of a man who had climbed the ladder of power and believed he belonged at the top. He styled himself as pragmatic, reasonable, a leader above the pettiness of partisan squabbles. But scratch that surface, and the contradictions started pouring out. Burgum's rise had been carefully staged. He came from the business world, built an image as a plain-spoken executive, then stepped into politics as though leadership was his birthright. He told voters he was a different kind of Republican, the kind who would cut through division and deliver results. It sounded refreshing at first, but as the spotlight intensified, so did the inconsistencies. One day he was the moderate voice suggesting compromise, presenting himself as open-minded. The next day he was towing the hardline, dismissing concerns about equity, waving away questions about systemic injustice. When it suited him, he leaned on the language of unity. But when the base demanded red meat, he delivered it with a grin. That duality wasn't just opportunism. It became the foundation of his political persona. And here's the danger of building on contradiction. Sooner or later, the record catches up. In 2019, Burgum gave an interview that, at the time, barely made a ripple. He spoke candidly, presenting himself as a truth-teller, a man who acknowledged uncomfortable realities. But buried in those remarks were words that would come back to haunt him, words that painted him as reasonable back then, but exposed him as hypocritical now. For years, those lines lay dormant, forgotten. Until Jasmine Crockett unearthed them, the irony was rich. Burgum had spent years sneering at his critics, accusing them of being inconsistent, of playing politics, of twisting narratives. Yet his own career was stitched together with contradictions so blatant they practically begged to be exposed. He projected calm in hearings, but behind that calm was fragility. When challenged directly, he often bristled, his tone sharpening, his smile faltering. He wore his confidence like armor, but it was armor made of paper. He relied on bluster, on the assumption that no one would bother digging deep enough to confront him with his own past. Crockett did. And that's why the moment struck so deeply with audiences. For years, they had watched politicians like Burgum skate by on double speak. They had seen leaders rewrite their own histories in real time, trusting that no one would hold them accountable. Burgum became a symbol of that arrogance, the man who thought he could contradict himself endlessly, and no one would dare call it out. His downfall wasn't sudden. It was gradual, woven through every smirk, every dismissive wave of his hand, every time he acted as though accountability was beneath him. The hearing was simply the culmination, the moment when years of contradiction collided with a single, undeniable fact. His own words were now the evidence against him. And here's the dramatic tension. Burgum had no idea the trap was waiting. He entered the hearing convinced of his superiority. He believed his record could be glossed over, that his rhetoric would carry him through. But Crockett had spent the time he never thought anyone would. She had studied, documented, and prepared for the exact moment when his past would betray him. That's the essence of the villain arc. The downfall isn't imposed from outside, it comes from within. Burgum's contradictions weren't accidents. They were choices. Each time he reshaped his narrative to fit the moment, he laid another brick in the wall of hypocrisy. And by 2023, that wall was so high it was impossible to miss. So when Crockett read his own words back to him, it wasn't just a takedown. It was poetic justice, The audience wasn't merely watching a sparring match. They were witnessing a reckoning. Years of contradictions collapsed in an instant, and the mask Burgum had so carefully crafted slipped for the world to see. But while Burgum's story was riddled with contradictions, Crockett's journey was something entirely different. Jasmine Crockett's story did not begin in the marble halls of Congress. It began far away from the insulated world of privilege that men like Doug Burgum inhabited. She was not groomed for power, not handed the microphone, not ushered into rooms where decisions are made. She fought for every inch of ground she now stands on, and that fight shaped her into someone who could not be shaken when the stakes were highest. Born and raised in Texas, Crockett understood struggle from the beginning. Her community was no stranger to inequities, economic, racial, systemic. She saw firsthand how dignity could be stripped from people who lacked wealth or status, how families could be ignored by leaders who promised much and delivered little. Those early experiences carved something into her character, a refusal to accept injustice as normal. Before she was a congresswoman, she was a lawyer, not the kind who chased prestige, but the kind who took cases others overlooked. She defended the vulnerable, the marginalized, the ones who couldn't pay for high-powered attorneys but still deserved their voices to be heard. Her courtroom presence was described as electric, sharp, unflinching, anchored by a belief that truth was not negotiable. She didn't win every battle, but every case reinforced her conviction that power must answer to principle, and that's the difference. Where Burgum built his career on projection, Crockett built hers on perseverance. She didn't rely on image, she relied on grit. She knew what it meant to be underestimated, to walk into rooms where people doubted her, and to leave those rooms having proven them wrong. That cycle, dismissal followed by vindication, became her fuel. Her path into politics was not a calculated climb, but a natural extension of her advocacy. As an activist, she had already been standing on the front lines of movements demanding fairness, dignity, and equity. When communities called on her to represent them in public office, she answered, not because it was convenient, but because she believed the fight for justice demanded her presence. In Texas, she became known for her fierce questioning, her unwillingness to let anyone dodge accountability. She gained a reputation as someone who didn't posture for cameras but spoke directly, sometimes bluntly, because she knew the cost of silence. To her constituents, she wasn't just a representative. She was proof that authenticity could still survive in politics. That authenticity is what resonated. Crockett didn't rehearse a persona, she lived her convictions. When she challenged hypocrisy, people believed her, because they knew she had lived the struggle she spoke about. When she demanded dignity, they knew it wasn't an abstract principle. It was personal, it was real, and that's why her clash with Burgum carried so much symbolic weight. He embodied the politics of performance, the smooth veneer hiding contradiction. She embodied the politics of substance, forged in the fires of lived experience. When they faced off, it wasn't just two figures in a hearing. It was two worldviews colliding. Think about the contrast. Burgum had the privilege of choosing his image, shaping it to fit the political winds. Crockett never had that luxury. She had to be sharper, tougher, more prepared, because every misstep would be magnified, every flaw exaggerated. That pressure refined her into a kind of leader Burgum could never imitate. Her colleagues had noticed it long before this hearing. Crockett's ability to remain steady under pressure, to slice through obfuscation with precision. She didn't need theatrics. She only needed the truth. And when she spoke, people leaned in, not because she shouted, but because she carried the weight of authenticity. This authenticity was her armor. In politics, image can crack, power can fade, but authenticity cannot be stolen. Crockett carried that into the chamber the day she faced Burgum. While he leaned on bravado, she leaned on preparation. While he counted on his record being untouchable, she had combed through it line by line. And while he assumed no one would call him out, she knew the time had come. Her lived experience made her ready. Every courtroom battle, every activist rally, every night preparing cases for people without power, Those moments sharpened her instincts. She knew how to wait for the exact opening, how to use silence as a weapon, how to let truth speak louder than volume. And in that hearing, as the cameras rolled and the stakes grew heavier, it was all of that: the struggles, the advocacy, the resilience, that converged into one defining moment. So when their paths collided in that hearing room, history was waiting. The hearing began like so many others: a long table, bright lights, the hum of cameras capturing every movement. Burgum leaned into the microphone with the casual confidence of a man convinced the outcome was already written. His answers were smooth, almost rehearsed, each phrase delivered with the cadence of someone who believed repetition could make contradictions sound like truth. He smirked when challenged. He tilted his head, dismissive, when asked about inconsistencies. Every gesture was calibrated to signal superiority: shoulders back, voice steady, eyes narrowed just enough to feign patience. It was a performance, and he played his part well. Crockett, by contrast, said little at first. She sat with her notes neatly arranged, pen in hand, eyes focused. Her silence was not passive. It was strategic. She studied him, letting his words pile higher and higher, brick by brick, building the wall of arrogance that she would soon bring down. The cameras caught it all, Burgum growing looser, more cavalier, while Crockett remained composed, her expression unreadable. As the questioning progressed, tension thickened. Each time Burgum sidestepped, Crockett's eyebrows flickered, barely perceptible, but enough for the attentive viewer to sense she was cataloging every dodge. The room began to feel less like a routine proceeding and more like a chess match. He pushed forward, confident in his openings. She waited calm, setting her pieces in place. The drama was cinematic. At one point, Burgum chuckled, leaning back as though the very idea of being cornered was laughable. But the chuckle rang hollow, and those watching sensed it. Crockett's gaze didn't waver. She didn't smile, didn't react. The silence between his words became heavier, more dangerous. Viewers at home leaned forward, sensing the stakes rising. This wasn't just testimony. It was a test of endurance. Who would break composure first? Would Burgum's arrogance hold, or would Crockett's silence give way to the strike everyone could feel building in the air? The exchanges quickened. Burgum's answers grew sharper, his tone carrying a faint edge, a trace of irritation he could no longer hide. Crockett remained steady, asking questions with surgical precision, each one cutting closer to the heart of his contradictions. The audience in the room shifted in their seats. You could feel it. Something was coming. And then a pause, a long pause. Crockett lowered her pen, folded her hands, and looked directly at Burgum. The camera zoomed in, catching the slight tightening of his jaw, the faint twitch of his lip. It was the look of a man who suddenly realized he was being led somewhere he did not want to go. The silence stretched. It was no longer Burgum's stage. Crockett had seized the moment without uttering a word. And then came the moment no one saw coming. It began with a question that sounded ordinary. Crockett leaned into her microphone, her tone even, almost understated. She asked Burgum to clarify his position, something he had just said, something that mirrored his usual talking points. He answered confidently, maybe too confidently, certain that his rehearsed rhetoric would stand as unassailable truth. The words came out smooth, polished, delivered with the swagger of a man who thought he had faced this kind of challenge before. But Crockett wasn't interested in surface answers. She was leading him toward the precipice. With her notes in front of her, she paused, adjusted her glasses, and allowed the silence to expand just enough to signal that something was about to change. Then, with deliberate calm, she pulled out the transcript. "Governor," she said evenly, "I want to make sure I understand you correctly, because back in 2019 you said," and she read his words verbatim. The moment landed like thunder in a room that had been deceptively quiet. The phrasing was unmistakable, the voice behind those words his and his alone. Crockett's cadence was measured, not rushed. She let each line hang in the air before moving to the next, ensuring there was no mistaking what was happening. Burgum was being dismantled by his own past. The reaction was instantaneous. Burgum's face froze, his practiced smile evaporating in real time. His jaw tensed, his eyes flickered downward, then darted back up as though searching for an escape route that wasn't there. He shifted in his chair, the kind of nervous shift that cameras catch and replay endlessly. Around the room, heads turned, staffers exchanged glances. The stenographer's pen hesitated for just a fraction of a second, as if even she needed to absorb what had just been said. You could hear a cough in the back of the chamber, the scrape of a chair, and then a silence so complete it felt like the entire building was holding its breath. Crockett didn't flinch. She let the silence linger, using it as a weapon. Then she spoke again, reading the next line of the 2019 interview, the very line that contradicted the posture Burgum was striking today. The murmurs began softly, like ripples across water. A few staffers shifted uncomfortably. Reporters typed faster, realizing they had just witnessed the soundbite of the day, the kind that would be clipped, replayed, and shared endlessly. Burgum tried to recover. He leaned forward, attempting to interject, his voice carrying a sudden edge. But Crockett didn't raise hers. She simply looked at him, then at the transcript in her hands, and continued reading. She didn't need volume. She had the truth, and in that instant, the power dynamic inverted. It was no longer Burgum commanding the room. It was Crockett. With composure and precision, she dismantled the edifice of confidence he had spent years constructing. Every word she spoke was his own, every phrase a reminder that his contradictions weren't speculative. They were documented, undeniable. Viewers at home felt the shift viscerally. Screens lit up with live reactions. On Twitter, hashtags began to surface. #Crockett vs. Burgum, #receipts ready, #2019 says hello. Memes appeared within minutes, sighed. Eyed screenshots of Burgum in 2019 versus Burgum in the hearing, captions dripping with irony. Play stupid games, win stupid prizes. One tweet read, garnering thousands of likes. Another simply posted the quote from Burgum's old interview with a single flame emoji, retweeted across timelines like wildfire. Back in the chamber, Burgum's voice faltered. He tried to dismiss the quote, suggesting it was out of context, but Crockett was ready. She had the full transcript. She read more lines, layering his contradictions until the weight became impossible to shrug off. The brilliance wasn't in her aggression. It was in her restraint. She didn't mock him. She didn't gloat. She just held the mirror steady, letting him confront the image he had created. And the more he struggled, the clearer it became that he was unraveling under the pressure of his own history. The cameras zoomed in, capturing the beads of sweat at his temple, the way his smile strained as he forced it back onto his face. It was the look of a man unmasked, a man realizing that his opponent had done what few dared to do, call him out with evidence he could not erase. The energy in the room was electric. You could feel the audience, both present and virtual, leaning forward. Every pause from Crockett, every stammer from Burgum, became part of the choreography of collapse. And then came the final blow. Crockett closed her folder slowly, placed her hands on the table, and looked directly at him. "Governor," she said softly, "those are your words, not mine." It was over. The silence afterward was louder than any outburst. It was the silence of realization, the silence of a mask cracking, the silence of a career moment spiraling out of his control. Outside the chamber, the explosion was immediate. Cable news anchors interrupted broadcasts to replay the clip. Commentators scrambled to analyze what they had just witnessed. Twitter threads stacked thousands of replies deep, each one amplifying the takedown. For Crockett's supporters, it was vindication, a moment where dignity and truth triumphed over arrogance. For Burgum's allies, it was damage control, a desperate attempt to spin what was already cemented in the public consciousness. And for millions of viewers, it was catharsis. They had seen leaders dodge accountability for years, But now they watched a man undone not by political opponents, not by media spin, but by his own words. It was a reminder that truth, when wielded with courage, can still cut through the noise. The hearing moved on, but the moment lingered. People knew they had witnessed something that would ripple far beyond the walls of Congress. Crockett hadn't just scored a point. She had shifted the balance, creating a viral flashpoint that would live far longer than the news cycle. But this was only the beginning, because once the clip hit social media, the reaction was explosive. The clip didn't just spread, it detonated. Within minutes of the hearing's adjournment, snippets of Crockett's mic drop were already bouncing across timelines. One 30-second cut, showing her reading Burgum's 2019 words back to him as his face stiffened, amassed hundreds of thousands of views before the ink was even dry on the stenographer's notes. Hashtags sprang up like wildfire. #Crockett vs. Burgum led the charge, soon joined by #receipts ready and #own words own goal. By nightfall, these phrases weren't just trending. They had taken over the digital conversation. TikTok edits layered dramatic music under Crockett's calm takedown, turning the exchange into cinematic reels that played on endless loop. Twitter users posted side-by-side stills, Burgum in 2019 speaking confidently in an interview, and Burgum now shrinking under Crockett's gaze. The caption was simple: consistency is undefeated. For ordinary viewers, the experience was communal. A college student in Chicago texted a group chat, "Y'all have to see this. She cooked him with receipts." A family in Houston replayed the clip during dinner, shaking their heads in disbelief. In Los Angeles, a group of friends at a bar held up their phones, shouting over the noise as the video played, each pause punctuated by cheers. Cable news could barely keep up. By prime time, the exchange had already been replayed across 3 major networks, anchors cutting in with breathless commentary, a stunning moment in today's hearing. Governor Burgum facing the ghosts of his own past words. On one panel, a commentator smirked. That wasn't an attack. That was a surgical procedure. Celebrities joined the chorus. An actor tweeted, "I want Jasmine Crockett to represent me in every argument I've ever had." A musician posted the clip on Instagram with the caption, "This is how you shut down hypocrisy, with grace." Within hours, the video had leapt from political circles into mainstream pop culture. Meanwhile, Burgum's team scrambled. Statements were drafted, tweets hastily typed and deleted. Aides huddled in back rooms trying to spin the narrative. But spin only works when people are still listening, and the internet had already moved on to laughter. Memes outpaced press releases 10-1. His every attempt at explanation was drowned out by looping clips of his stunned expression. For Crockett, the reaction was tidal. Supporters flooded her accounts with messages of gratitude and pride. Donations spiked. Comment sections overflowed with affirmations. Finally, someone held him accountable. This is what leadership looks like. Jasmine Crockett, it is the voice we've been waiting for. And the ripple effects extended further still. High school debate coaches queued up the clip as a teaching tool. Political science professors cited it as a case study in rhetorical preparation. Even comedians wove it into their late-night monologues, their punchlines always ending the same way: Burgum, undone by his own words. What gave the moment such staying power was the emotional payoff. Audiences weren't just entertained, they were validated. For years, many had watched politicians dodge accountability, rewrite their positions, and escape consequences. Crockett's calm dismantling offered a release, a reassurance that truth could still triumph in public life. Watching her unmask Burgum wasn't merely satisfying, it was cathartic, a collective exhale of pent-up frustration. And yet, beneath the viral frenzy, something more profound was stirring. People weren't only laughing at memes or retweeting hashtags, they were reflecting. Families talked about integrity at dinner tables. Community groups cited the clip as evidence that resilience and preparation matter more than arrogance. Young viewers, especially those from immigrant families or marginalized communities, saw in Crockett a reflection of themselves. Someone who stood tall, armed with truth, and prevailed. Burgum's contradictions had provided the spark, Crockett's composure had supplied the fire, and the internet had carried the flames everywhere, but beyond the memes and viral tweets, something deeper was happening. In the days after the clip went viral, something remarkable happened. The conversation shifted. It wasn't only about Jasmine Crockett versus Doug Burgum anymore. It was about what their clash revealed. People began asking deeper questions. What does it mean to lead with dignity? What happens when arrogance collides with accountability? And why does truth, no matter how long it lies buried, always find its way back into the light? Crockett herself leaned into the bigger message. When reporters asked her about the viral moment, she didn't gloat. She didn't frame it as a personal victory. Instead, she redirected the spotlight. "This was never about me," she said. "It's about reminding people that truth matters, words matter, and when you take an oath to serve, you owe this country honesty, not hypocrisy." That sentiment resonated far beyond the headlines. For progressives, for immigrants, for young people searching for integrity in leadership, Crockett became more than a Congresswoman. She became a symbol. Her calm dismantling of Burgum was proof that preparation and principle could overcome bravado. She showed that power isn't about who can shout the loudest, but who can stand firm in dignity when tested. And that was the heart of the moral lesson. Arrogance may dominate the room for a moment, but it cannot withstand truth. Hypocrisy may win short-term applause, but eventually the record catches up. What Crockett demonstrated was timeless. The idea that America is at its strongest not when leaders posture, but when they are willing to be accountable, transparent, and honest. Viewers across the country felt validated. For the immigrant family who had long been told their voices didn't matter, Crockett's composure was a reminder that dignity outlasts dismissal. For the student who had been mocked for speaking up in class, the viral clip was a lesson in patience, in the power of waiting for the right moment to let truth speak. For communities often left unseen, it was proof that resilience is not weakness, it is strength. Burgum's contradictions collapsed in real time, but Crockett's example expanded. Her moment at the microphone became more than a takedown, it became a parable. A reminder that leadership is not about avoiding your past but owning it, not about silencing others but listening, not about wearing confidence like armor but carrying truth like a compass. In a political era clouded by spin and spectacle, Crockett delivered something rare, clarity. And people responded because clarity is what they were starving for. It was bigger than partisanship, bigger than a single hearing. It was about the enduring belief that honesty still has a place in the American story. The viral clip became a mirror, reflecting both what we fear and what we hope. On one side, the danger of arrogance unchecked, of contradictions piling high. On the other, the promise of leaders who remember that dignity is not just a posture, it is a duty. And so the viral clip wasn't just about one hearing, it became a mirror for America itself. So when we look back at that moment, Jasmine Crockett dismantling Doug Burgum with his own words, it wasn't just a viral clip. It was a turning point, a reminder that no matter how polished the performance, no matter how confident the facade, arrogance always collapses under the weight of truth, and Crockett proved it in front of the nation. That's why this video exists, not just to replay the takedown, but to remember what it means. To see in real time how dignity outlasts bluster, how preparation defeats performance, and how honesty can still pierce through the noise of politics, as entertainment. And now the choice belongs to us. Do we let moments like this fade into the endless scroll, forgotten by tomorrow's headlines, or do we amplify them, share them, and build on them, turning one clip into a movement? If you felt that surge of pride watching Crockett hold her ground, if you felt that rush of vindication when truth cut through arrogance, then don't stop here. Be part of it. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the stories that matter. Share this video with someone who needs to see it. Add your voice to the chorus that refuses to let arrogance win over truth. Because in the end, moments like these aren't just entertainment. They are reminders. They are proof. They are the sparks that can ignite something larger. And if there's one thing this hearing taught us, it's this: dignity will always speak louder than power.